Thank you, Pauline, for that generous introduction. And a big thank you to the organizers as well for inviting me to this beautiful city with its rich history and its gorgeous surroundings. It really is a pleasure to be here. I should say that as a proud European, it's a pleasure in particular to be here at the European Society for Aesthetics. We live in a world, unfortunately, where a narrow-minded nationalism in all its different forms is very much on the rise. So I think a society or an event that brings people together across boundaries, across national borders, deserves our full and enthusiastic support. Having said that, I'm ready to begin. Let me just switch the screen a bit. But before I really get started, let me warn you that my talk is quite long. It's going to be about 50 minutes long, and it has many slides. So there's going to be 60 slides in total. And this is not because I think that what I have to say is so important, but it's rather because I unfortunately have, and I've always had, a bad case of stage fright, which means that I am usually very nervous before I have to give a talk, and I'm afraid that I'm going to forget what I have to say or mess up what I'm going to say. So in order to prevent that, I've just made sure that everything I want to say is on the slides. Now, this is not how it's supposed to be done, I know, and it's not necessarily helpful for you, but please know that it's helpful for me to have this backup. And so I want to thank you in advance for your understanding. Okay, so let's get going. So here's the structure of my talk. So first, I'm going to give you some background on the origins of my project and how I got thinking about existential aesthetics in the first place. Secondly, I'm going to try and explain what existential aesthetics is and is not. Thirdly, address some potential concerns. And then fourthly, and finally, I'm going to try and explain why it's important to foreground this new area of research. So the background then. Many philosophers of art and aesthetics choose their field of study because art or certain aesthetic pursuits are of deep significance to them. I haven't done any empirical research on this, but it's an informed guess. So we're here in a room full of philosophers of art and aesthetics, and my guess is that many of you will have chosen your field of study because you care about art, because you care deeply about art. It certainly is true for me. So some works of art have had a profound effect on me throughout my life. And just to show you that I'm not lying, I'm going to give you two examples. So here's a picture of the so-called Before trilogy, directed by Richard Linklater. And when I saw the first film, Before Sunrise, long time ago, I fell in love with it. I really did. So I saw it multiple times. And when I saw it, I felt like butterflies in my stomach. And I went to see it several times. And then when the sequels came out, Before Sunset and Before Midnight, I felt like that love only deepened in a way. So I went to several screenings. Again, I organized a joint screening of these films. I went to visit the locations where these films were made. It's the kind of silly stuff that one does when one falls in love with someone or something. So that's just one example. Here's another example, quite different. So this is a portrait drawing by Hans Holbein, which was made in the 16th century of a woman It's usually referred to as a woman with a white hairdress, and we don't know who this woman is. When I first saw this, that was in the National Portrait Gallery. It was during a quiet day, so I was the only person in the room there. And the room was dimly lit. I think that helped. And it was part of an exhibition called The Encounter. And while I was standing there in front of this portrait drawing, that's really the feeling I had, like a feeling of an encounter. And I had the sense of across the seas of time, encountering someone in this drawing in a way that I found incredibly mesmerizing and moving. Because that's one of the reasons why I found it to be so moving, was that this portrait was made of someone who was clearly very important in their time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had Hans Holbein make their portrait. And yet she had been completely forgotten, so fallen into oblivion. And I found that really poignant. And it's one of the few times that I actually found myself to be in tears in front of a work of visual art. So 2 examples just to illustrate that art has profoundly affected me in the course of my life. And I want to go a bit further and say that precisely because art has had this deep significance to me, that's why I came to study philosophy of art and aesthetics. So when I was doing my PhD, I was studying philosophy, and starting my PhD, and I had to decide which area to focus on. In the end, that didn't prove to be a very difficult decision, because I figured, well, I care about art. I love philosophy. I love art. So I'm going to do philosophy of art. What can go wrong? And it really felt like it was a marriage made in heaven, so to speak. And for a very long time it was. But recently that kind of changed. I think 5 or 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, I grew disappointed with mainly my own work in aesthetics and philosophy of art. And I felt a bit disenchanted, and so I started reflecting on why that was. So I took a look at the work I had done in aesthetics, and so here are some of the essays or book chapters that I wrote at the time. I see that that's not really very visible, but so one of the topics I've written about is the role of the artist's intention in the interpretation of art. As Pauline had mentioned, I've also written about the difference between erotic art and pornography. And another topic that I started writing about was portraiture, and I wrote an essay on what makes something a portrait. So what's the difference between a portrait and a genre painting, or a portrait and a pastoral scene, for instance? And I wrote these in these papers, and I edited these books, and I did that, I think, in a way that I did enjoy myself, but after a while, it dawned on me that something was missing, and that something was the fact that none of these really touch on the deep significance that art holds for me. So while it's fun to think about these topics, none of them really, at least that's the way I felt, none of them really went to the heart of why I care about art. So why did I write about these topics then, if they didn't address what I really care about in art? The short answer is because I could. So those are the topics I could write about. And there's a bigger story here, and maybe if there's enough time in the Q&A, we can pick this up, but those are the topics that were being discussed at the time in the literature, and certainly as a junior scholar, that's what you're supposed to do. Like, you look at the existing literature, and you try to see whether you can maybe add an objection or formulate a new account, and people were writing about the intention of the artist in the interpretation of art. Stecker, Eiseminger, Sherry Irvin, Levinson. Portraiture was being written about by Cynthia Freeland, Paolo Spinici, and other people. And similarly with the erotic art versus pornography discussion, people were writing about that. And so I thought I can make a contribution to that. But if I'm honest, it wasn't really what I was interested in when I was thinking about art. So 5 or 6 years ago, I thought, enough of that, really. So I decided to take things more personally, and I decided to write about the ways in which art and aesthetic experience have been centrally important to me. And so the first thing I wrote was an essay, a short essay on what it means to fall in love with a work of art. And my key example was the Before trilogy. And then later on, I also edited a book on the Before trilogy, as Pauline had mentioned. I also started thinking about why I was so moved by this particular portrait. And I wrote about this in an essay which has as the subtitle, On Being Moved by Portraits of Unknown People. And later on, when I reflected a bit more on that particular emotion that I felt, it dawned on me that maybe this was an instance of what I have come to call aesthetic melancholy, when you reflect on harsh existential truths, such as the fact that at some point we will all be forgotten, but in a way that makes some experiences stand out more, or can make you appreciate the beauty of what you're looking at even more. So that's a case, I would say, of aesthetic melancholy. Now, while I was doing that, I was also keeping my eye on the rest of the field. And I was noticing that other people in aesthetics and philosophy of art were also writing more and more about the ways in which art can be of real importance to people or have a profound effect on people. One of those people is in the room here, Maria Jose Alcaraz Leon, who wrote about aesthetic intimacy, which is the feeling of profound connection that some artworks and artists can engender. At the same time, John Holliday was writing about the same phenomenon, but specifically in relation to fictional literature. I'm just going to give you a few examples. See, I'm blending in already. UC Sarian has written a book on effect in artistic creativity, Painting to Feel, in which he examines how painters pursue certain kinds of affects via painting because they galvanize, enrich, and restructure their overall sense of being. This means, and these are his words, this means that painting and painterly affectivity carry considerable existential import, as he calls it. Dieter de Klerk, my colleague at the University of Kent, wrote a really nice essay on irony, disruption, and moral imperfection, about how engaging with ironic storytelling, such as the one we find in the comedy series The Good Place, can yield existentially significant insight. Kathleen Higgins, as many of you will know, has been writing about grief and mourning. So in this essay, Life and Death in Rock, she discusses the role of stone memorials in dealing with existential matters of life and death. She's also written about the role of music, for instance, in dealing with matters of life and death. And in her new book, she considers how aesthetics can be helpful in dealing with these very existentially important moments in life. Nick Riggle is another prominent aesthetician that is worth mentioning. Here, he's written on what he calls transformative expression. So the fact that art can radically change our lives and selves. And this is something that Anthony Aumann has also written about. Art and Transformation is an essay I always recommend to people. And a final example, Gerald Levinson, another prominent figure in contemporary aesthetics, has this essay about how you are what you audit. So you become or you are what you listen to. At least that's been the case for him. So he says, the music that I have responded to most deeply as a listener over the years is perhaps the dominant element in the fabric of my life. So it's become really crucially important to him. And these are just a few examples. So there's something, at least that was clear to me. So something has been going on in the last few years that I find really interesting. Something genuinely new, I think, in the field of aesthetics, at least as I have known it. Because when I was starting out in aesthetics and philosophy of art, there was none of that, and I double checked. So I went back to the reference works that in my time were seen as the works of reference in aesthetics and philosophy of art. So the Blackwell Anthology in aesthetics and philosophy of art and the Oxford Handbook of Aesthetics. And if you look at the table of contents here, so it has 46 different articles, the Blackwell Handbook that is, and not one of them addresses the existential importance of art, not one. And the same is true for the Oxford Handbook of Aesthetics. So I thought that was pretty relevant. I thought this is something I want to write about, and I wrote the essay Existential Aesthetics, which was published in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism in 2022. In that essay, I tried to explain what existential aesthetics is and is not, and I'm going to briefly summarize it for you before going on to what I think is the most important part of this talk. This is what I think existential aesthetics is. It's philosophical work that investigates the various ways in which works of art or certain aesthetic practices or aesthetic experiences can be of existential importance to people. So when I say that works of art or aesthetic experiences can be important to people, this can mean individual people. For instance, when you reflect on the 10 albums that changed your life, for instance. But it can also mean communities. So how certain works of art or aesthetic experiences can be important to communities, like really important, or perhaps even to humanity as a whole. Like we're facing a climate crisis at the moment, which I think, rightly so, is an existential crisis for human beings. And so you can reflect on how art maybe can play a role in addressing this. And Ben Okri actually has done just that. And in this study for The Guardian, he asks like, how artists should confront the climate crisis and what role art can play. And you're not going to be able to read that, but he calls for something like, what he says is existential creativity. And so that's a way in which maybe art and aesthetic practices can be important in addressing an existential crisis at the level of humanity. Anyway, now existential aesthetics, I think, is a distinct area of research, but one which has, I think, some overlaps with other areas or debates in aesthetics. So take the book I was referring to earlier on, Jussi Saarinen's book about painting. That's a contribution to the philosophy of painting. But I think it's also a contribution to what I would say is existential aesthetics. Overlaps of this sort are to be expected. One has them in all sub-areas of philosophy and aesthetics. I don't think that's a problem. And I don't think they prevent existential aesthetics from having a distinct identity. And I think that's important to note. So while there are affinities between, let's say, existential aesthetics and everyday aesthetics, it's helpful not to equate the two. And just to make that point, existential aesthetics does not need to focus on everyday phenomena, but it can focus on works of high art. Take the portrait I was referring to earlier. Conversely, everyday aesthetics may examine experiences that have no existential import. For instance, Sherry Irvin, in a really nice paper on everyday aesthetics, gives this example. I run my tongue back and forth on the insides of my closed teeth, feeling the smoothness of their central surfaces and the roughness of the separations between them. That's an experience, like an everyday experience that you can aesthetically enjoy, but I think has no existential import. Now, it's also important, I think, to distinguish existential aesthetics from public philosophy. I see existential aesthetics as part of the academic discipline of philosophy of art and aesthetics. So, for instance, Nick Riggle's essay on transformative expression is an instance of existential aesthetics, but it's not public philosophy. It's aimed at academic philosophers. It's very much an academic paper. And working public philosophy, I think you'll agree with this, does not have to focus on themes or topics that are of crucial existential importance to people. So if you take the brilliant Aesthetics for Birds blog, which I think is a venue for public philosophy, they talk about all sorts of topics, and only some of them will really touch upon things that are of existential significance to people. So on this slide, we'll show you like an entry on the death of the author. Public philosophy, not existential aesthetics. Finally, and maybe most importantly, existential aesthetics is not to be confused with existentialist aesthetics. This is an important one. Existentialist aesthetics, and I'm here referring to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, of Philosophy, I should say. Existentialist aesthetics is, or you could define as contributions to aesthetic thinking made or inspired by existentialist philosophers such as Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Gabriel Marcel, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre. It's pretty obvious that one can engage in existential aesthetics without subscribing to the tenets of existentialism. Nick Riggle, Levinson, myself have made contributions, I think, to existential aesthetics, but we're not existentialists. Conversely, not everything that fits under existentialist aesthetics will count immediately and ipso facto as existential aesthetics. So existentialist philosophers, and Sartre is actually a good example, existentialist philosophers have made contributions to the ontology of art, the philosophy of fiction, the nature of imagination, and really valuable contributions, but none of them really address the existential importance of aesthetic experiences. None of those contributions address those, or the existential importance of works of art. Not directly, at least. Right. So having given you this brief summary of what existential aesthetics is and is not, let me address some potential concerns. And this is new material here. I'm departing from what I wrote about in the earlier essay, and it will allow me also hopefully to refine some of the things I said earlier on. I want to consider three potential concerns. I'm also slightly concerned about that dog there. Three potential concerns. One is, isn't the account too thin? Secondly, shouldn't this be subsumed under hashtag first world problems? Thirdly, isn't this old hat? So let me begin with the first concern. Existential aesthetics, as I've defined it, is philosophical work that addresses the various ways in which art and aesthetic experiences can be of existential importance to people. Now, in the original paper, I make a distinction between two ways in which these can be of existential importance. So a work of art can be existentially illuminating when it clarifies certain aesthetic or existential questions, or it can be existentially impactful when it profoundly affects the course or the quality of a person's life. Now that's a neat distinction, but so the objection might go, that account is too thin and too imprecise. Surely there are other ways in which works of art and aesthetic engagements can be of existential importance. Moreover, like if a piece of sculpture were to fall on me and break my spine, now that would profoundly affect the course and quality of my life, but it doesn't mean that it's of existential importance to me. And I really like this objection. This was actually a referee who made this point, and I think they're 100% right. So it made me realize that my account, as I presented it earlier, was too imprecise. So we need a more substantive and precise account. And that's what I want to present to you now. So I want to argue that works of art and aesthetic experiences or practices can be of existential importance in at least 6 different ways. They may help address certain existential questions or an existential crisis. or they may precipitate an existential crisis. They may give meaning to life or make life worth living. Potentially, number 4, they can bring about or constitute an epiphany. They can be transformative. And last but not least, they can evoke or be expressive of existential feelings, emotions, and moods. And I'll briefly introduce each of these different ways. Works of art can help to address certain existential questions or even an existential crisis. It raises the question, what is an existential question? Here I'm just borrowing David Benatar's formulation that existential questions deal with the most fundamental concerns we have as human beings, such as how to face our own finitude and mortality, how to cope with the human condition, is there a purpose to life, does it all make sense? And an existential crisis occurs when such queries become particularly pressing. For instance, when people are desperate to make sense of their life and existence. Okay, I think we have an idea of what existential questions are and existential crises can be. I simply want to make the point that works of art help us sometimes to deal with this. A really good example is given in John Stuart Mill's autobiography. I'm sure some of you are aware of this, that John Stuart Mill, at the age of 20, fell into a really severe depression. And he talks about this at length in his autobiography. And what pulled him through, and I don't know whether you know this, is art and beauty. And more specifically, it was the beauty of Wordsworth poetry that really helped him out of this existential crisis. This is John Stuart Mill. What made Wordsworth poems a medicine for my state of mind was that they expressed not mere outward beauty, but states of feeling and of thought colored by feeling under the excitement of beauty. From them, I seemed to learn what would be the perennial sources of happiness when all the greater evils of life shall have been removed. I needed to be made to feel that there was real, permanent happiness in tranquil contemplation. Wordsworth taught me this. So just one example. Here's a more recent example. This is an essay by Mala Chatterley in Aeon, where she writes about how she was saved from the brink of suicide by the novel Infinite Jest. So novels can have this effect on people. And just to show you that it's not just works of art that can have this effect, aesthetic experiences can do so as well. Here's just a brief reference to the film Taste of Cherry. And those of you who have seen this film will know that the main character talks about his own depression and the fact that he was going to kill himself. And he tells the story of how he was going to this orchard with a rope, climbing a tree to fasten the rope in order to hang himself. And then he says, then I felt something soft under my hand. Mulberries, deliciously sweet mulberries. I ate one. It was succulent. And then a second and third. Suddenly, I noticed that the sun was rising over the mountaintop. What sun, what scenery, what greenery. I felt happy. Then I gathered some mulberries to take them home. My wife was still sleeping. When she woke up, she ate mulberries as well, and she enjoyed them too. I had left to kill myself, and I came back with mulberries. A mulberry saved my life. A mulberry saved my life. So basically, the aesthetic, pleasurable experiences of mulberries in that glorious setting is what convinced him not to kill himself and to overcome that existential crisis. Now, works of art, maybe unfortunately, can also precipitate an existential crisis. And here's just one example of an author who says that after watching Citizen Kane, they had an existential crisis. So works of art can do that, but sublime nature can also do this. And for instance, this article claims that if you watch a particular time-lapse video of the Grand Canyon, you will have an existential crisis. The idea being that being faced with the temporal sublime and your own insignificance might, for the first time perhaps, raise certain existential questions like, what am I doing here? What does my life mean? Like, I am this tiny speck in this vast cosmos. Thirdly, irrespective of any existential questions, works of art may just give meaning to life or make life worth living in the strongest possible sense of that word. Just this newspaper clipping of someone who says that dance gave my life meaning before I know that I needed meaning in my life. And I'm sure you can think of other examples like that, maybe even taken from your own experience. Works of art can bring about epiphanies, and sometimes aesthetic experiences can count as an epiphany. For those of you who are interested in epiphanies, Sophie Grace Chappell has written a great book about epiphanies, and she gives this helpful definition of what an epiphany is. And she says it's an overwhelming, existentially significant manifestation of value, often sudden and surprising, which feeds the psyche, which feels like it comes from the outside, which teaches us something new, which takes us out of ourselves, and which demands a response. Now, in that book, she gives several examples, and you won't be surprised to hear that some of these examples are taken from art. But she also gives the example, and I'm sure that some of you will be familiar with this, taken from Iris Murdoch's book, The Sovereignty of the Good. It's perhaps the most famous passage in that book, where she talks about looking outside of her window. I am looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious of my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige. Then suddenly, I observe a hovering kestrel. In a moment, everything is altered. The brooding self, with its hurt vanity, has disappeared. There is nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important. Sophie Grace Chappell says that's an epiphany. And like the contemplation of this kestrel, I think, could legitimately be called an aesthetic experience. If so, it's just an example of how an aesthetic experience can count as an epiphany. Works of art or certain experiences can also be transformative. And in philosophy, transformative experience has become a technical term since Laurie Paul published her book, Transformative Experience. Transformative experiences are experiences, you could say, that radically change the experiencer in both epistemic and personal ways. A person transforms epistemically when they gain knowledge of what the experience is like that they could not have had otherwise. A person transforms personally when key agential features such as core preferences, life goals, the way they maneuver through the world change. Standard examples of transformative experiences are becoming a parent. Like when you become a parent, the idea is that can be transformative. You change as a person. I'm not saying that happens all the time or for every parent, but it can be a transformative experience. But I think, I hope you'll agree with me, that art and aesthetic encounters can also be transformative in this technical sense. Maybe you can think of examples of your own, but here's an example that is discussed by Jean Kwok in The Guardian. And she writes about how, for her, writing a poem was a transformative experience. She was off on a particular career trajectory that had nothing to do with art, and her values seemed to be quite removed from art, but writing that one poem changed her completely, transformed her, and she abandoned her studies and decided to become a writer. It really changed her life fundamentally. This is maybe a sillier example of how people, after watching certain films, and these are actual people who decided to emigrate. this guy moved to New Zealand after watching The Lord of the Rings. So yeah, works of art can be transformative in all sorts of ways. Finally, works of art can evoke or be expressive of existential feelings, emotions, and moods. This is not my area of expertise, but in combing through the literature, I noticed that a lot of people are writing about this. I've already mentioned Jussi Saarinen's book on painting to feel. And in that book, he argues that painting may induce oceanic feelings, which involve a sensation of self-boundary dissolution, which can best be understood as shifts in existential feeling. And existential feelings, as he understands them, are pre-intentional background feelings that structure experience as a whole. They are ways of finding ourselves in the world. Other authors prefer to talk about certain existential moods. For instance, David Weberman refers to maximally existential moods as philosophical because they reveal something about the general character of being human. Now, I think a good example of an existential mood might be ennui, what the French call ennui, which is not being bored because, say, your train is delayed, but because you have no idea how to act meaningfully in a meaningless world. Works of art can express, I think, or be expressive of this particular existential mood. And I can't think of a better work of art than Antonioni's film trilogy, which seems to be expressive of that very basic mood, L'Avventura, La Noche, and L'Eclisse. Then there are people who prefer to reflect on what they call existential emotions, existential gratitude, for instance. There's a whole literature on existential gratitude, which is being grateful not for this or that in particular, but for one's life or for existence as a whole. And again, there are works of art that are very expressive of this. If you haven't read Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty, it's a marvelous novel. And I think the final page of that novel is extraordinary. And it really is very expressive of what I would like to think of as existential gratitude. So to sum up, I think works of art and aesthetic experiences or practices can be of existential importance in a number of ways, at least 6. Now, this is ongoing research. It's a provisional list. If you have other suggestions for me, they would be very welcome. Obviously, some artworks will tick more than one box. For instance, Jean Kwok's transformative experience of writing this poem, I think also counts as an epiphany. But nevertheless, I think the conceptual distinctions I made are real and informative, at least I hope so. I don't think one can be subsumed under the other. So just to give you a few examples, not all epiphanies will constitute transformative experiences. For instance, Iris Murdoch's epiphany, I don't think is a transformative experience. The transformative potential of art does not always come in the form of an epiphany. Anthony Aumann, in his article on art as transformative, has this really good example of Molly, who watches the film Free Solo about mountain climbing. And that sets her on a trajectory that is transformative, but it's not sudden. So it wouldn't count as an epiphany straightforwardly. But I think it's a really good example. Some artworks may give meaning to life irrespective of any existential musings. I've already given this example. This is just to illustrate that the third way in which something can be of existential importance cannot be reduced to the first 2 ways, which focus on existential questions. Okay, so that's one concern, hopefully out of the way. Second concern, pondering existential questions. Isn't that really a luxury? If you're a member of an oppressed group or a marginalized group, you're going to be too busy trying to keep your head above water to start musing about the meaning of life. So shouldn't all of this just be filed under #first world problems? In other words, isn't existential aesthetics only of interest to white, cis, male, able-bodied philosophers? Now, I think the short answer is no. But I really take this objection seriously, and I've thought about it. So I want to give you a robust answer. And it's going to be a threefold response. First of all, as I've just noted, the second concern here focuses on existential questions. But I've just tried to explain that works of art can be of existential importance in other ways beyond merely raising existential questions or addressing existential questions. For instance, they can help to give meaning to life or make life worth living. And this is going to be all the more so in precarious circumstances. This article is a good source. It gives you many examples of people oppressed or in marginalized circumstances who've clung to art as something that is of central existential importance to them. One example being that of the musician Mostafa Zimitamar, who said about his art, like he was detained, he was in prison for a very long time, that music is a tool for preserving my sense of personhood. It is so I don't forget that I am a human being. So clearly it's of existential importance to him, but he's a member of a persecuted minority. Secondly, I just want to make the point that existential questions are not the prerogative of privileged people. Each person, no matter their station in life, I think, can face existential questions simply in virtue of being human. Here is a quote from Kiran Setia from his book Midlife, which if anyone is struggling here with a midlife crisis, I really recommend. It's a great book of philosophy. He talks about what existential questions are, specifically to midlife. And I think these can come to anyone, no matter what situation you're in. Questions of loss and regret, success and failure, and so on. Thirdly, true. If your life is in imminent danger, in situations of oppression, you will have little time to pause and ponder the big questions in life. I think that's true. If philosophical questions are going to arise in that situation, they will more likely be questions of justice and fairness, about what is morally right or morally wrong. However, I think such questions, justice and morality, can be, and in fact often are, stepping stones to more existential ponderings. For instance, like being faced with an injustice might lead to precisely these kinds of questions, like what an absurd world is it where one group of people is allowed to exploit another group? So how can the universe be so indifferent to such unnameable suffering? So these questions are lifted to the level of like real existential musings, I think. And that is the point that Paul Taylor also makes in his essay on, very influential and great essay on Black aesthetics. He says, racial conditions inflect the general existential considerations of despair, joy, meaningfulness, and absurdity. If the prospect of life's meaninglessness is terrifying, how much more terrifying is it to be enslaved and stripped, even of the feeble existential armaments, such as religion, language, ties to one's ancestors and descendants, with which humans try to ward off despair. And he adds, the existential challenges of life under white supremacy have famously been subject to Black aesthetic production, and he gives a few examples. And he's also quite significantly, I think, adds, there's also been the subject of aesthetic criticism and theory, from studies of Black music by Angela Davis and Leroy Jones to Saraya Hartman's remarkable study of slaves being forced to dance for their masters. And so I want to say any existential aesthetics worth its name can and should make room for the voices of the oppressed, and really stands to be enriched by the important work that has already been done in this area. Okay. Final concern, and I will deal with this very briefly. We're near the end of the presentation. I'm happy to report. It's this, like, the idea that beauty and art can be of vital importance to people, oh, that's not new. Isn't it like old hat? Plato already writes about the vital importance of art. Nietzsche very much writes about the vital importance of art. Heidegger has written about the epiphanous potential of art. Kierkegaard has written on the existential import of the aesthetic life, of the transformative power of art, and so on and so forth. So how can I present this as a new sub-area of aesthetics? Well, in a way, I don't and I do. So the first thing I want to say is I think it's a newly emerging field within the field of aesthetics that I'm familiar with, which is Anglo-American aesthetics, broadly speaking, maybe analytic aesthetics. And I want to make the comparison here with environmental aesthetics. So as the first sentence in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, environmental aesthetics is a relatively new subfield of philosophical aesthetics. It arose within analytic aesthetics in the last third of the 20th century. And one of the pioneering essays was Ronnie Hepburn's Contemporary Aesthetics and the Neglect of Natural Beauty. Now, when he wrote that in 1966, of course, that doesn't mean that no one before him had written about natural beauty. Obviously, in the history of philosophy, many philosophers have written about natural beauty. In the 18th century, there was Kant, there was Burke, there was William Gilpin, there was Uwe Dahl Price. In the 19th century, there was Thoreau, there was John Muir. So clearly, people had been writing about nature before the second half of the 20th century. Nevertheless, what happened was that Hepburn was looking at the work of his contemporaries in his field as he saw it and noticed that no one really was doing that. And so that's why he was one of the key figures, and only one of the key figures in starting what has now become a really significant subfield called environmental aesthetics. Basically, I want to make the same point about existential aesthetics. I do think it's something newly emerging within the field as I know it. Of course, it doesn't mean that no one has written about existential concerns and art before. Clearly, they have. But when I looked around 5 or 6 years ago and certainly 10 years ago at aesthetics, the field as I was moving in, that wasn't present. And certainly going back to when I was a junior scholar, think again of those handbooks that I showed you, no one was writing about this. So there was a neglect there, and I think it needs to be addressed and is being addressed. I think I could make the same point about everyday aesthetics, but I'll skip that and move on to the final part, which is why is this a good thing, basically? So existential considerations are coming more and more to the foreground in our discipline. It's a growing sub-area, I think, and it has, that's definitely true. It has great potential for expansion. I think philosophers should be encouraged. I want to encourage you all here, of course, to try and help to fulfill that potential. And I just want to give you a couple of good reasons for doing this. I think it might help to underscore the relevance of aesthetics within philosophy. It might enhance the relevance of aesthetics outside of academia. It can provide a common ground between analytic and continental philosophy. It can, and I think it presents an interesting common ground between art and philosophy. And then it may also have some personal relevance. May. Aesthetics as a discipline, I think, has been pushed to the margins of philosophy, unfortunately. And I'm pretty sure that all of you will agree that that is an unfortunate event, if you want to call it that. It used to be more central. If you think about Kant, if you think about Hegel, those towering figures in philosophy thought of aesthetics as really central to the profession. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. Now, this has multiple reasons, I think, multiple causes. But I think one of the reasons is that many of our colleagues in philosophy tend to think of aesthetic features as mainly or merely decorative. They think of art as a hobby and as a luxury. It's nice. Aesthetics is nice, but it's not of any fundamental significance to human beings. And it's certainly not worth the same sort of attention as epistemology, knowledge gets, or morality. Well, I think once we start foregrounding the existential importance of art and aesthetic experience, I think it's going to be much harder to make that case that aesthetics is just the icing on the cake. So it might help us with the relevance of aesthetics within philosophy. It might also help to address or enhance the relevance of aesthetics outside of academia. Aestheticians, philosophers of art, and of course I count myself among those, we're sometimes surprised that our work finds no uptake outside of academia. So I've, as many of you have, I've published essays, I've published books, but they're not read by a lot of people. And that's fine with me in a way, but it's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care that much, but I do find it a pity that the work that we're doing here is not really taken that seriously in the art world or beyond academia. And that's odd if you think about it, because so many people are really deeply invested in the arts because they make art, because they appreciate art, they go to museums, they paint, and so on. And yet so few have any interest in aesthetics as a discipline. So that's, I think, a really odd mismatch. I'm being optimistic here, but I think existential aesthetics might help to change some of this, since it addresses themes and topics that are never just of academic interest. If the making or the appreciating of art occupies an important place in one's life, then it should not be difficult at all to relate to work in existential aesthetics, because that's precisely the sort of aesthetics that is about the ways in which art and aesthetics is of real importance to people. There was a time, and that's not so long ago, that analytic philosophers did not pay much attention to existential matters, in stark contrast with continental philosophers. I was trained as a continental philosopher, but then I moved into analytic philosophy. I consider myself an analytic philosopher. And I guess as a result, I haven't been doing anything on existential matters for most of my career. That is now changing. Analytic philosophers in general, and philosophers of art and aesthetics in particular, are engaging more with existential matters. When they do so, I think they may be inspired, they should be inspired by what continental philosophers have done. And in turn, hopefully they can inspire their continental colleagues. So I think, I hope existential aesthetics might be this field where the two shall meet. Again, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I really think that might be the case. Common ground between art and philosophy. When people are faced with existential questions, that's in general when they turn to philosophy, that's when they turn philosophical, they ask philosophical questions. It's also when they might turn to art. And here I'm just going to defer to Ethan Hawke, the actor and director and author who played in many different films, and but including also, of course, the Before trilogy. And he did a recent video, which I kind of liked, and in which he tried to address this question: what is art for? He's not a philosopher, but I think the answer he gives makes sense. So he says, most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about poetry, right? They have a life to live. They're not really that concerned with Allen Ginsberg's poems or anybody's poems until their father dies. They go to a funeral, you lose a child, somebody breaks your heart, they don't love you anymore, and all of a sudden you're desperate for making sense out of this life. And you ask yourself, has anybody ever felt this bad before? How did they come out of this cloud? That's when art is not a luxury. It's actually sustenance. We need it. So art is there to address us in these times of existential need. And philosophy as well, I think, is eminently placed to address or raise existential questions. So looked at it that way, there's a real common ground between the two. They may do so differently, and it's interesting to think about those differences, but they have that in common. Yet that is curiously under-examined, I think, in philosophy of art. So much material nowadays is being written about the ethical dimension of art or the cognitive value of art, and all of that's great. But there's so much less on the existential importance of art and the similarities and differences with philosophy in that regard. And I think that's worth writing about as well, this interesting common ground between art and philosophy. Finally, I'm just going to return to the very first claim I made, that many philosophers of art and aesthetics choose their field of study because art and certain kinds of aesthetic pursuits are of deep significance to them. Undertaking work in existential aesthetics, I think, may be a way to reconnect with that original spark of interest. It certainly has been for me. I have decided, as I said, in my philosophical work, at least, to take things personally. And for me, that's been a blessing. So if you're in any way similar to me, if your relation to art and aesthetics is in any way similar to me, I can only encourage you to do the same. Thank you.